Hello gentlemen, this is Ohio Dan. The topic for today's video is what I call traditional conservatives and the brass tacks problem. And this is not something that I haven't talked about before at all on my channel, but this is sort of the succinct way of putting it that I've come up with here recently. And what I'm referring to is how there's this phenomenon where traditional conservatives today will get together and they'll talk about how men and women just need to work together. We just need to respect each other. And yes, we need to move on from feminism, but it's not about walking away. It's not about quitting on the system. We need to help each other. And if we're going to make things better between men and women again, and so on and so forth. And the problem with that is that when you get down to brass tacks, as the saying goes, there's no substance to that argument whatsoever. There's no plan. There's no methodology. Really, it's just about sustaining the status quo, where women have most of the advantages. So, traditional conservatives, for the most part, are the ones that make this argument. They like to talk about moving on from feminism by just having men and women work together again. And usually this involves a reference to men and women having major respective issues, right? We both have our problems, we both have our issues, but we need to work on them together in order to resolve these issues. We can't work on them separately. Well, major problem with that is that there is no actual plan, as I've stated, for how to accomplish this, aside from vague references to compassion or teamwork or mutual respect for one another. But when you get down to brass tacks, there's nothing there. There's no substance to it. And of course, the saying means when you actually try to put something into practical application, when you try to take something and make it work, and you get down to the nitty-gritty, how's this going to go way of doing things, way of trying to make things operate, brass tacks means getting down to that process, actually making it happen, actually looking to see if it's going to be something that is viable or not, if it's something that's going to be workable or not. And so when you get down to that level, when it comes to what traditional conservatives like to say about men and women working together, there is no substance. There is no methodology. There is no nitty-gritty, let's apply this in a practical way. It's just these vague sort of pleas for men and women to work together without having any sort of even recognition of the framework in which that would have to take place. The problem is that this conveniently manages to bypass even acknowledging gynocentrism as the predominant force between men and women today in this society. It pretends that women have issues at the same level as the ones that men face, and this really is not true when you try to make the comparison, right? You cannot compare manspreading, mansplaining, and the wage gap myth to homelessness, suicide, and not being allowed to see your own children. These things are just not comparable. And yes, I'm not saying that women have zero issues, but men's issues are exponentially greater if we're actually looking objectively at the problems that men and women face. It's just clear that men's problems are greater. Right? Gender roles are so one-sided that asking a woman to make you a sandwich is considered sexist, but expecting a man to pay child support for kids that he barely gets to see and barely has any access to anymore, that's just what a real man does. You can look at how one-sided reproductive rights are. Men's reproductive rights basically consist of don't stick your dick in crazy, while women are fighting for their right to delete their fetus before it can be born as a child. That's how one-sided reproductive rights are. Who has the bigger issue? Well, it's men, because men effectively don't have reproductive rights. It's very clear when you break it down that men have more issues that are worthy of concern than what women do. So, again, these issues that men have are just not being addressed, and no amount of teamwork is going to fix this without the laws and the cultural norms that we have today changing. There's just no way to make this work from the perspective of working with women to get a better result. Because she can work with you right up to the point where she files divorce and takes half your stuff. She can work with you right up to the point where she makes a false accusation against you so you get fired from work thanks to the Me Too movement and its current level of success within the workplace. She can work together with you right up to the point where she's violent toward you in the home and you have no recourse because the Duluth model for domestic violence says that you as the man are never the victim in that situation. Only a woman can be a victim in a case of domestic violence. She can work with you right up to the point where she betrays you, and then she has the upper hand because in this society, the pendulum has swung so far in women's favor that you as a guy have very little recourse to turn to. That's the problem, is that it doesn't address gynocentric reality. It doesn't address or attempt to resolve the problems in terms of actually making things fair. It just makes these vague pleas toward men to basically continue to be part of a system that just wants to basically take advantage of them from the get-go. And that's not going to work. That's not actually going to solve anything from a guy's perspective. It really is just about maintaining the status quo because the status quo benefits women. And traditional conservatives fit into this neatly. They're the ones I think that tend to make this argument the most because traditional conservatives don't give a shit about men for the most part. They don't want to acknowledge gynocentric reality or any of the points that I've just mentioned because to do so goes against their ideology of men just need to fulfill their role and be a real man and do what men have always done because it's just expected. And how dare you actually do things based on your own incentive? How dare you actually do things based on what's actually healthy for you by choosing to avoid interacting with most of the women around you? You can't do that. You need to get married. You need to have kids. You need to fit into this system. That's what traditional conservatives, by and large, I think that's overall a fair way of putting it. That's what they tend to want men to do. That's the demand that they try to place on men. So it makes sense that rather than acknowledging that we have a gynocentric system and that men have little reason to participate until things change, or unless they actually do change, which seems kind of unlikely, that men basically are better off not getting married, not having kids, not living with a woman, not dating a woman that you work with because of Me Too, and so on and so forth. And so it makes sense that traditional conservatives would go down this line of thought of, well, feminism's bad and we don't like what feminism's done, but just walking away, that's just as bad as feminism. And you need to work together with women if you're a guy because that's the only way that we can work towards something better. But if the laws and the culture aren't going to change, if they're not going to improve from a guy's perspective, all of that adds up to no substance whatsoever. All of that is just a crock of crap because there's nothing that actually is going to offset the liabilities and the disadvantages that you have as a man in putting yourself in that position and having that mindset. Because ultimately, this society is rigged against you in many ways. And if we can't even acknowledge that, if we can't acknowledge that women have so many of the cards in their favor, then everything that follows from that is just based on nonsense, right? Much of this approach is about obfuscation so that we avoid doing the cost-benefit analysis from a man's perspective should the status quo continue. Should we continue to have these laws and these cultural norms that are very anti-male and that very much work against you if you are in a conventional or traditional relationship with a woman? It's all about confusing men so that they think there's an opportunity to continue to work with women even while women continue to have the upper hand in regard to all these aspects of relationships and just general interactions between the genders. It's basically a trick. It's basically an attempt to confuse men so that they continue to make poor choices instead of potentially considering something like going your own way or basically just dating casually or whatever form that it takes. In other words, not getting married, not having kids, basically. That's the attempt, is to basically confuse men so that they continue to put themselves in these vulnerable situations where they can lose half their stuff, where they can lose their job, where they can have to deal with a violent person in their domicile, where they have to put up with all these one-sided things to where you have to have a man cave because the rest of the house basically belongs to her. It's a desire to preserve this status quo where women have these advantages and men just fall in line under the illusion that if we just work together, somehow the outcome will be different. Well, it can be different until she divorces you anyway, until she makes an accusation against you anyway, until she takes your kids from you anyway. That's the problem, is that there's no meat to this. When you get down to brass tacks, there's nothing of substance here whatsoever other than maintaining the status quo between men and women in a way that is very much disadvantageous to you as a man in many circumstances. As long as the laws and the overall situation for men remains unconducive for working together with women, there is little reason to take the idea of doing this seriously in a broad sense. It's not going to matter. It's not going to lead to a different outcome. It's just going to put you as a man in a more vulnerable situation because you bought into the idea that if we just work together with women that we can solve our respective problems. That's not the situation at hand. The situation at hand and the starting point to any real conversation about fixing things between men and women has to be an acknowledgement of the gynocentric state of affairs brought about by feminism and traditional gynocentrism. That's just where things stand if you actually want to have a real conversation about fixing things between men and women. Do I think things are going to be fixed between the genders in this society? No, not really. And I don't want to get into that too much in this video. I understand trying to advocate for your rights and advocate for reform, but the problem is that you have to get a large percentage of women on board, and I don't see any evidence that that will ever happen, right? Where are the women coming out against Me Too and marching in support of men's due process rights versus the women putting on hats that represent their genitalia and marching on Washington because they think women need to have more rights because they didn't like who got elected president? It's clear that most women either flat out identify as feminists, or if they don't, they tacitly support feminism and gynocentrism. So on that basis, the opportunity for reforming things is pretty low because women pretty much have control over this political system and over what is culturally accepted and not accepted at this point. But again, without going into that a whole lot more, the only chance that things can be reformed is if men essentially demand that the game change before they're willing to play. If men basically quit getting married, quit living with women, quit messing around with women that they work with, quit having kids in the conventional way where they basically just provide children to the woman because the woman's going to have the majority of authority over those children because of the way our culture and our legal system is. If men stop doing that in droves, then maybe there's a chance at reform, but that's not what any of this is about. It's about tricking men more or less into thinking that somehow just working together with women as a team is going to resolve anything. And the problem, again, is that a particular woman can work with you as a team right up until the point where she doesn't want to do that anymore. She's not happy. She divorces you. She takes half your stuff. Oh, she doesn't want to have a kid. Well, it doesn't matter whether you wanted to have a child with her or not. It's her body, her choice, right? That's the problem, is when it reaches that point, you see who really has the power. And all this is about confusing men so that they think there's an opportunity to still have healthy interactions with women. And you could still have that. I'm not saying that there's nothing positive whatsoever in terms of interacting with any women out there, but the deck is stacked against you. And if we can't even acknowledge that from the get-go, then everything else is basically a lie and an obfuscation from that point. All of this rhetoric about men and women just magically working together adds up to a bunch of nonsense once you get down to the brass tacks and evaluate what actually needs to be done to make interactions between men and women healthy again. And if we're not going to be honest about the situation at hand, we're not going to realize and accept that men have far more issues to deal with than women. And it's not about working on our issues together. It's about the laws and the culture needing to change in order for men to really have any reason to want to participate in conventional or traditional type of relationships with women, or again, even really dealing with women that you work with outside of work, or in places where you have affirmative consent, sleeping with women. It's a matter of acknowledging that these laws and these cultural norms have to change, and if they don't, there's really very little reason for men to participate, and all this stuff about men and women just somehow magically working together is not going to do anything whatsoever to change things in a way that's actually healthy or that's actually an improvement for men. All it's going to do is continue the status quo so that you as a man can get taken advantage of. And my take on this is that we as men should not fall for this nonsense when primarily traditional conservatives like to talk about men and women just working together and somehow vaguely just solve all of our problems, because that's not going to work. That's just an attempt to pretend that the issue is different than what it is. If you're not going to improve things for men based on the issues that men have, then there's really no reason to entertain this idea, because men and women cannot work together in a healthy way if we can't even acknowledge the gynocentric reality of our current culture and the current state of affairs between men and women. There are no issues for men and women to work together on to resolve as long as things are so one-sided against men in this overall dynamic. There's nothing to work on unless things are going to be better for men, and that is not where this type of mindset comes from. It is about trying to continue the status quo so that men continue to invest in an overall process that's basically designed to work against them.